Welcome to Len'en 4, Brilliant Pagoda or Haze Castle, which is the only game I can think of that has or in its name. I'll call it BPoHC for short from now on. It's an obscure, free, roguelite Toho-style bullet hell from hell where you can out-hell to bullet hell. I have an odd relationship with this game, a bit of love-hate, though I like it overall for what it is. It's absurd, charming, breakable, and filled to the brim with content by bullet hell standards. It's also almost janky, awkwardly designed, and poorly balanced games I've ever played. If you ask me, this is almost the perfect game for my channel, despite it being a hard left turn. Doesn't always have to be a first-person shooter or dungeon crawler, I suppose. I tend to have a love or hate relationship with roguelikes, or roguelites, in this case, in general. Either they suck an unhealthy amount of hours out of my life, or they bore me so intensely I can't complete a single run. I mean, Repentance has probably sucked a chunk of my soul out at this point. Thanks, Tainted Eve, you're unfathomably worse than Tainted Lost. Anyways, BPoHC definitely leans towards the addicting side for me, at least in both the early and late game. There's no doubt that it's a unique title with a lot of interesting ideas, and interesting execution, to best put it. Despite a laundry list of flaws, it keeps me engaged in a lot of strange ways and has permanently occupied a small part of my mind rent-free since I played the demo back in 2016. Is this game able to surpass its bizarre design to be something great? How good of a bullet hell roguelite is it? Well, it's my duty to try finding that out. The job description specifically only says to try, so let's get on with it. This game, along with its predecessors, are all free. Unlike previous titles on my channel, you can easily acquire them off the website of their creator, Jank. I've likely included a link to download these games in the description. They're relatively new, so I imagine they run just fine on all modern systems, or at least Windows systems. Resolution options are most limited on my channel up to this point, which is unfortunate, but I personally prefer playing bullet hells in smaller windows anyways. I have also included a link to the English patch I used in the description, unless YouTube hated the link or something. I'm currently learning Japanese, but there's a profound amount of text in this game, and a lot of it is still beyond me, so the patch is rather important if you don't speak Nihongo, at least fluently. It's super easy to install, as it effectively just requires you to replace some text files and install a font. This game has an absurd amount of dialogue, so the fact that it's fully translated through volunteer work is one heck of a feat. Fun thing is, since almost all the text is stored in the form of TXT files, you can freely edit whatever you want. Naturally, I named some of my most hated spell cards things you aren't allowed to mention in polite company. That's it for the technical side of things. You should have no trouble whatsoever getting this to run. Before I get into BPoHC proper, I should make it clear it is the fourth title in the Len'en franchise. Not to be confused with the famous Soviet president, Gorbachev. I'll give some quick mentions to the rest of the franchise here. If you just want to hear about BPoHC itself, skip to the premise section. First off, however, is the elephant in the room. It's hard to not draw comparisons between Len'en and Toho. To summarize, Toho is effectively the poster girl of bullet hells, known for its overwhelmingly female cast, top-notch soundtracks, inspiration from Japanese mythology, and, of course, its dense, pretty bullet patterns. It's among the most well-known and beloved indie franchises out there. Len'en and Toho have many fundamental things in common. 6 stages and an extra, bosses organized into spells and non-spells, a power gate, a point of collection, a fantasy land overrun by yokai where human teenagers do all the dirty work, and so forth. You can hear some influences in the music too. Heck, much like how most of Toho's the work of Zune alone, Len'en is overwhelmingly the work of one man, known as Jank. I hesitate to call Len'en a Toho clone since it does a lot of its own things and actually beat Toho to numerous punches. BPoHC came out years before Toho's equivalent unconnected marketeers after all. Regardless, Len'en builds off of a foundation set by Toho and does many of its own unique things with it. There are some fundamental differences between Len'en and Toho too. You can go to absolute edges of the screen since you're bounded by your hitbox, the white dot, and not your character sprite. Some attacks don't exactly account for this. Upon defeat, bosses start to explode dramatically and the game goes into slow motion. You're not safe during this time period, so watch out. The graze box, or thrill box, I guess, is exceptionally tiny. It's hard to graze bullets unless you borderline touch them, which I guess makes sense, but it's overly punishing and it makes gathering flash bombs, another distinct mechanic in this series, more difficult. I'll talk about those shortly. This isn't a Toho video, so I'll only make references to it when mandatory from now on. The first game in the series is Evanescent Existence, or EE, which sets up the premise for the rest of the franchise. To clumsily summarize it, an uber-powerful and oppressive priestess known as Surubami Senri abducts a bunch of androgynous teenagers into a world known as Mugenri. She grants them powers with the intent of some of them filling in for her while she's on vacation in the outside world. From there on out, it's mostly hijinks. The protagonists of the series are Subakura and Yabusame, as they're the ones Surubami takes as her replacement, but there are plenty of other playable characters in the other games. Franchise protagonists protagonist Subakura serves as a fast, highly damaging shot with a forward-focused laser. He's an apathetic genius who's vaguely annoyed he's being abducted to be a shrine maiden. Deuteragonist-chan Yabusame is a dimension-hopping idiot with a quirky spread homing hybrid shot. She followed her friends when they got spirited away and ends up being recruited by Surubami because she's good at beating people up. Score runners tend to use Yabusame for a comically long-lasting bomb. Lives are earned from score and most scores from bullet clears, so naturally, a long-lasting screen clear is a bountiful one. Retroactively patched into original trilogy was Suzumi Kuzu, who is an effeminate, possible serial killer who can charge up and unleash a ring of knives. You have to unlock Suzumi by beating the extra stage twice. The game wasn't designed with his shot in mind, so he sits in an odd place overall. Unfortunately, you need to beat the main campaign and extra stages Yabusame to unlock the other characters. It's a story concession, but a rather annoying one. If you prefer forward focus shots, you're stuck without one for a while. You can't just unlock them by playing easy mode though. I don't know a better time to address this, so I should mention that there's a quirk to the character designs in this series. Every character is intentionally androgynous, both in design and dialogue. I view this as every character's sex being up to personal interpretation. Originally coming from Toho though, I just default to most characters being girls. A positive side effect of this is that there isn't any weird, rampant sexualization going on here. The series may adopt an anime style, but it actually suffers from very few horrible anime tropes. This unique character design choice ends up giving the series a surprising amount of identity, that's for sure. Anyways, EE is known for its Gordian knot difficulty curve, gimmick-heavy bosses, borderless black bullets, and mostly stellar soundtrack. It's a game that focuses extremely strongly on bosses, which is something it does quite well. Bosses are super varied, and every one of them has a unique gimmick or theme of some sorts. The Stage 1 boss surrounds you in darkness, Stage 2 boss is about whirlpools, Stage 6 boss toys with gravity, and so forth. These gimmicks are used fairly cleverly to create compelling attacks, though some bosses are a bit more of gimmick grab bags. You'll face Subakura or Yabusame on Stage 3, depending on who you chose as a playable character. Both of them have a wide variety of tricks and gimmicks. Yabusame famously has this spell. I love spells like this. Extra boss Surubami is largely themed after attacks from previous bosses since she's the one who gave them their powers after all. I mostly like Surubami, but her first spell is one of the worst things ever. Invisible bullets. They have to read far ahead. Not my style. In fact, it's borderline a puzzle game with how many of these patterns you have to find out. Some things are really dumb, but I think it's a fun take on bullet hell pattern design overall. I find these bosses to be some of the most memorable of the genre. It's also one of the very few bullet hells I've played where the forward focus shot and homing shot are quite well balanced relative to each other, though recent patches skewed this in favor of the forward focus shot. But the stage design! All of the creativity seen in the bosses was siphoned out of the stages themselves. So much of the series is dodging simple, typically non-threatening patterns aimed at you by weak fairies. You'll be doing a lot of streaming or timed taps, sometimes speed killing if the game wants to be spicy. There's a lot of awkward downtime between waves of fairies, and bombs often trounce any formations that try to be threatening. A few too many formations come from behind you, from off screen, which can easily cheap you out if you don't see it coming. Subakura faces a unique gimmick on Stage 4, that is, fairies that fire vertical walls out. But if you're playing as Yabusame or Suzumi, you probably won't even realize these fairies exist because they go down so effortlessly. It's weird. Stage design woes like these are a consistent problem throughout the franchise. A similar problem is a difficulty curve. I did just say it's a Gordian knot after all. The second boss of EE, Aoki Aoli, is legendary for how brutal she is relative to her placement in a game. While her fight is learnable, she is extremely sadistic by Stage 2 boss standards. I don't find her so bad anymore, and I'm playing a perfect normal mode run of the fight on screen. Playing as Suba for it is a bit I don't know, cry me a whirlpool about it. I recently learned that on normal and unreal, you can dodge your second spell card by sitting perfectly still. Yes, this attack is harder on easy mode than on the hardest difficulty. This safe spotty design is just a sign of things to come. AOG got nerfed in the most recent patch, which I kinda dislike because I oddly liked her a bit more when she was so crushingly unreasonable. For the most part, she's harder than the final boss, but the final boss does whip out some ridiculously hard garbage at the end of his fight, so I guess it evens out. This nonsensical difficulty balancing, especially in early game, is a consistent problem with this franchise. It's often termed by fans as Len'en syndrome, and you know it's egregious when even a small, dedicated fan community creates a term to describe how bad it is. Overall, I like EE, in spite of its problems. It's probably my favorite of the original trilogy. It has an undeniable charm to it, and I wish more games took inspiration from its boss design philosophy. It's a puzzle bullet hell type ordeal, and as someone who really loves the Toho photography games, I'm all for it. Next up is Earthen Miraculous Sword, the second game in the series and the weakest and least plot relevant entry. EMS added a new playable character, Kuroji. He views Subakura as a superior and was spirited away along with his siblings, Aoji and Huaka. He's one of my personal favorite characters because he's a chaotic, greedy scamp who robs bird people and blackmails ancient reptilian pizza toppings. He has the power to flip things from front to back, which he canonically uses to flip burgers. His shot isn't great though. I don't care for the lasers getting drunk when he's unfocused, or his basically melee range bomb. This game also introduced a major recurrent mechanic, flash bombs. You won't see me using many of them in this game, but they're weaker bombs charged by grazing projectiles. You use them by bombing while in focus, which is quirky and hard to get used to, but not as bad as people tend to make it out to be. They don't tend to clear too many bullets, so they give you a second of invincibility that can, and will, save your life when used properly. Honestly, I just don't like this game, and it's hard to put it exactly into words. In comparison to EE, it lacks a lot of the gimmickiness and fun patterns. Its difficulty curve is arguably worse, or at least on the same level of wonkiness as EE. The slug-themed Phase 2 boss, Sho, is infamously stupidly hard. Much like Aoji, she got hit by the nerf hammer as well, though it's still pretty intense and long fight for a Stage 2 boss. In older versions of the game and on higher difficulties, he can still easily wall you in. The Stage 3 boss is also quite rough. Jinx really doesn't hold back to the early game bosses, does he? I wonder if it's a design philosophy thing. He obviously likes giving early game bosses some extra screen time, so I guess he just really wanted to go ham with a slug-themed boss. It would be really freaky if you would go on to make another unreasonably difficult slug boss later on. The difficulty curve is still rather inversed here. Stage 5 and Stage 6 are incredibly reasonable and rather easy overall. The first thing you see in Stage 5 can be dodged by sitting still. I love discovering dumb stuff like that. I do quite like the Stage 5 and Stage 6 bosses in this game, as they're easily its highlight. Stage 5 boss and best girl Sukune throws these big Hanwha golems at you. Jinx beat Zune to the Hanwha girl punch, and you should be proud of that. The final boss, Yaorochi, I don't know how to pronounce that, is a sword-themed boss fight. Should you fulfill certain conditions upon beating her, you'll face her Earthen Miraculous bottle opener, Tasoken, as a TLB. It's this 180 second long, vaguely musically synchronized survival card where all you can do is survive. I love this part where you need to use flash bombs to survive the entire screen being slashed, though I liked it a bit more back when it was a screen nuke. You're rushing to get flash bombs to survive the death walls as the music is reaching its climax. It's actually pretty great. Wish more of the game was like this. That aside, stage design is still terrible. In fact, it's probably the worst in the series. This game has an obsession with fairies that fire non-threatening aim patterns at you, sometimes even around you. They'll often come in extremely predictable formations too. If a group of fairies appears on the left side of the screen, that's your prompt that an identical group of fairies will then appear on the right side. Still a lot of downtime too. Good bullet hell stage design is usually active and varied, and this stage design is a polar opposite. Similarly to EE, this game was made easier in patches, and I think it's the easiest game in the series at this point. Hit a bit too hard with nerf Soken. Overall, I don't care for this one too much. Most of the good stuff is concentrated in Stage 5 and 6. Sukune is one of my favorite bosses in the series, so I guess the game at least has that going for it. Everything else is kinda to bad. Let's move along. Reactivate Majestical Imperial, yes that's the title, is the third game in the series. Introduces a tag team mechanic that greatly spices up the gameplay, even if the EMS team here absolutely trounces the others in terms of both power and survival. 4 potent bombs per life, free screen wipes, and the best forward focus shot in the series are a recipe for a stupidly powerful playable character. That aside, I like the idea of being able to manually switch between each playable character instead of each team just being 2 slightly different shots merged into one character. Each team is nuanced, so there's a lot of room to experiment and many different strategies for each one. I quite like the Kuroji and Salami team, who I use in most of my footage, Salami being the extra boss from EMS, who I didn't mention because their fight is rather bland. They're a team designed to be able to easily generate and spam flash bombs. Too bad neither of them can aim their shots very well. Salami's shot has a lot of noticeable gaps in it, and their bomb is probably the weakest in the franchise. It still does have the problem with the difficulty curve, but I think it's a bit less extreme here. Little Gashadokuro Sesei isn't too bad on normal mode, but she's one of the hardest Stage 1 bosses in the series on harder difficulties. The Stage 2 boss is reasonable here, shockingly, and her theme is pretty addicting. Sounds like an aggressive clown slot machine. However, instead of a hard Stage 2 boss, you instead have a hard Stage 3 boss. Ayazane is infamously rather tough, and her attacks go wild at the end. At least you can hang around at the top to milk this non-spell for a metric boatload of score. Nothing more thrilling than cowering at the top of the screen. Depending on the team you chose, you'll fight one of the other playable teams in Stage 4. I like these fights. It's cool to actually fight the other teams. The Shrine team is probably my favorite of the 3 fights, so that's part of the reason why I chose this clumsy shot type. These are surprisingly tame boss fights, though they occasionally whip out something nasty, generally easier than Stage 3. Fumikado here, who represents the Imperial part of this game's title, is a fun Stage 5 boss with a killer theme, but some of her attacks are oddly easy for her stage rank. I love her final attack where there's gradually less and less space to move. It usually coordinates with the music if you don't speed kill it or bomb too much. She's this game's true final boss, as it's quite literally impossible to lose to the Stage 6 boss. That's not just because the game is extremely generous with resources or because he's quite literally a newborn infant, but because you don't use lives for her fight. It's bizarre. As long as you didn't use a continue, making it to her is effectively a full clear. What is it with this series and easy final bosses? RMI is also the apex of stage design in the series, which is actually a bit of a backhanded compliment since it's still not good, just somewhat more varied. Jinx went for more atmospheric, slow-paced stages here, and it works fine. Still a lot of streaming though, there's a lot more variety to death fairies and their spawning patterns. I'm unironically fond of Stage 6, which consists of nothing but 2 harmless resource pinatas. It actually ends up being great tension building for the final boss and somehow manages to feel exciting rather than dull, unlike most of the other stage design in the series. Good work, I guess? The melon-themed extra boss, Tenkai, is also a franchise-wide highlight. She's got a lot of funky spell cards and some pretty varied nons. She's themed around barriers, which sounds boring until you realize that there's a lot of bullet warping going on with them. The rest of the extra stage kinda sucks though, with the stage proper being really drawn out and boring, and the bonus boss at the end being a heaping tablespoon of unfair resource drain BS. Heck, even Tenkai's final spell, Twin Cranes, is notoriously completely unreasonable. I can't tell what's happening for the life of me in this spell. Now, I've never used this term in any of my videos prior to this point, but when games throw blatant unfair resource drains at me, I mentally label them as a Twin Cranes moment, a term I christened after this specific spell. No one would get the reference, so I don't really use it. Tenkai's theme, called Present World Overhaul, is absolutely top-notch and might actually be my favorite theme in the series, if not a strong contender for my favorite. Just make sure you turn your volume to max right before the 3-minute mark, it gets unusually quiet there. Speaking of the extra, RMI has the infamous Absurdly Extra stage. If you've never seen it, then it's worth a watch to see how absurdly stupid it is. MIA YouTuber Pruns did a no-focus clear of it, which is one heck of a superhuman feat. Go check it out. And speaking of Present World Overhaul, the music in this series, well, I've put it off for long enough. It's definitely one of the things that people love most about it. I do want to establish early on that I think it's great, though it's definitely not everyone's cup of cha. It tends to be loud and chaotic, but also quite catchy. Jinx does a good job expressing things, conveying character, and creating atmosphere as his music, despite, or sometimes because of, that chaos factor. Some tracks are super long too. Some run over 5 minutes, though do know that that's the exception and not the rule. Have a tasty little morsel of the music from the first 3 games before I talk more about the music in BPoHC later on, in greater detail. Sorry if that was a little long, but I had so many options. I find these soundtracks to be consistently catchy and enjoyable to listen to. The names of some of these tracks are pretty hilarious, by the way. Like, what kind of title is Lick the Brand or Reach the Rice? What's the matter? I don't understand. It also does that Toho thing where a lot of tracks have both a Japanese and English title in one. I honestly never understood that, but it at least makes searching for some tracks on the internet easier. So, overall, this original trilogy is a series of flawed but notable little indie bullet hell gems. There's obviously passion in them and plenty of interesting bosses and gimmicks. Evanescent Existence, I can never pronounce that word right, was the most successful of its gimmicks, though the others have some fun ideas too. They're enjoyable enough and fun to come back to for a replay every couple years. I like them overall, and I find that the quirks and flaws end up adding to the charm rather than taking away from it. As for the rest of the series, there's also the recent Pagoda Cafe, which is a cafe simulator. That's a pretty natural evolution for an action-packed franchise, I'm sure. I bet the next Doom game will be about cooking. I haven't played this one, but it doesn't really sound like my speed, so I can't give an opinion on it. There's also Monochrome World, but that one's been in development for an age, and it's not released yet. And that's about it for the rest of the franchise. Time for BPoHC itself. BPoHC follows up shortly after the third game, though you don't need to play it to understand what's happening. Included with the game and the English patch is a text prologue, which gives you a brief summary of the events of the previous games, introduces a decent helping of important characters, and explains why most of the teams paired up. It's rather odd that a lot of the backstory is outside of the game, but it is pretty extensive, well over 500 lines of story here. That is a nitpick I have, that there's a lot of story and little details outside of the games proper. Regardless, I value your time, so I won't summarize each team's prologue. Instead, I'll just summarize the overarching plot. Two factions, the Dragonflies and the Imperials, are in the middle of a war, partially instigated thanks to a mysterious informant. Each of these factions represents one of the paths in the title, with the Dragonflies being the Haze Castle route and the Imperials being the brilliant Pagoda route. Both sides want their leader to become the Emperor of Mugenri. In the meantime, a rumor about a mirror and sake is spreading, causing all the yokai to come out in search of it. This is where the team of your choice comes in. Each team has their own motivations, but they're generally related to the whole war and sake thing. Beat up the leaders of an army, get some sake. Happens every day here, I suppose. I personally quite like the writing in this series, and BPoHC is definitely its apex. It doesn't take itself too seriously, though it never strays into absurdity, and it knows when to be serious. Jank is excellent at writing dialogue that feels charming and quirky without it ever feeling forced. No dialogue in this series ever made me cringe, to best put it. I do wonder how much of it is lost on me thanks to both language and cultural barriers, though I like the sense of humor in general. An example of this humor is a running gag that is the final boss of the first game. His name? Wilhelm von Clausewitz Halcyon Hisuimaru, the eternal synthesis bearing the alias of Chaos who manipulates gravity at will. Wish he was playable. Humor aside, the quality of the writing is consistent and the world is surprisingly developed and interconnected. If you're the kind of person that like lore in your games, this should be a pretty easy sell for you. Lore tends to be rather naturally mixed into the dialogue, and lore dumps themselves are rare. Plus, something I like about Len'en over Toho is that it doesn't have that same villain of the week theme to its writing, so antagonists end up actually being important or returning characters. In fact, most of the playable characters in BPoHC are bosses from the previous games, and all playable characters can show up as bosses. For instance, Fumikado, the antagonist from Len'en 3, is a playable character here. Some characters have connections to the factions and bosses that makes their storylines more interesting to play through. There's a profound amount of dialogue in this game anyways. You have 5 playable teams consisting of 3 characters a pop total, with each team having their own set of dialogue for every boss. Plus, there's also the fact that each team has 4, technically 5 different endings. Most of these endings are rather short, but that's still a good few endings. In a series that already has a ton of dialogue, this game especially has a lot of dialogue. If you don't like reading, it's okay. You can just hold down the shot key to rapid fire skip past dialogue bullet train style. It's just an absurdly fast skip that the human brain cannot comprehend how fast it is, much like how we'll never figure out how a galloping horse's legs are arranged when it's completely off the ground. Is that too esoteric of a joke? Anyways, I'm finally going to discuss BPoHC's gameplay. This game is rather mechanically complex, so I'll summarize everything as succinctly as I can. I'll talk about the fundamental basics, assuming you're at least vaguely familiar shmups. Now, one of the first things you'll see is a team selection. You pick your characters from almost initially overwhelming rosters I've ever seen in a video game. Each trio of characters on the screen represents a team. 5 teams of 3 characters in total, with one team being a secret team you need to unlock. When you pick a trio, you get to pick who you want to be your main, sub, and support. Respectively, these represent who you want to be your shot type, who you want to handle bombs and flash bombs, and who you want sitting out, generally doing nothing. How lazy of them. Eventually you unlock the ability to create custom teams, which greatly expands the meme build potential, but that's endgame material. Now, like most other shmups or bullet hells, BPoHC has limited lives and bombs. They're both exactly what you'd expect. Run out of lives, it's a game over. However, you can take a lot of punishment here thanks to the barriers and health system. Barriers are layered on top of your health and will deplete before your health does. If you go roughly a minute without taking any damage, you recharge a barrier. Under the barriers is your health, and when you run out of health, you lose a life. The amount of health and barrier you have generally depends on who the team's main shot is. Some characters have more health or barrier than others. Some teams have a lot more barrier than others. Bombs are, as I said, standard shmup fare. Temporary damage and vulnerability on top of variable damage and utility, depending on who's in your sub-slot. Most team setups have a maximum of 5 bombs, with one exception. Death bombing is still present in this game, and oddly, it's one of few ways to restore your health. Bombs can be used to skip over attacks, but you should be careful because you can only get them from mid-bosses and the end-stage boss, so they can be in limited supply. More important than bombs, however, are flash bombs, which are charged up by grazing bullets / generating thrill. Flash bombs may be weaker than normal bombs, but they're far more consistently accessible with much more utility usage in this game. They can range from borderline screen clears, to efficient momentary invincibility, to long-lasting invincibility accompanied by bullet reflection, to plain old massive damage output. Since you can rapidly charge them up, they are quite exploitable. Late insert because I literally forgot about this. This game also has multiple different types of bombs. Bombs dropped by bosses have a small chance of being special bombs. Depending on the type, using one will either max out your power, barriers, or both. They're rather powerful and can save you in a pinch, though you have minimal control over when you get them. They do highlight a funky quirk to the bomb system, and it's that you can only use bombs in the order you acquire them in a queue order if you're familiar with that. First come, first serve. On top of the low maximum bomb limit, the bomb system is an interesting bit of design that simultaneously encourages both spamming bombs and being reserved with your bombs. I like it. Now, back to the team mechanics. The setup of your team is fairly important. Some characters are ridiculously beneficial having specific slots, especially with upgrades. In general, most characters are surprisingly well balanced and always have a place somewhere on your team. Only a couple are abjectly worse than average or exceptionally powerful. I'll quickly talk about a couple notable examples of some of these slots because I'll be here all day if I talked about all of them. I'll try to show the characters on the screen as I mention them in order to make it clear who I'm talking about. I've only invested dozens of hours into this series and many dozens more into its soundtrack, so I remember most of this. My personal favorite main shot in this game is the Len'en, Tenkai. Her primary shot is a homing shot. As she accumulates power, she gains a train of laser familiars that trail slightly behind her. These lasers fire horizontally when you focus and vertically when you unfocus. It sounds complicated and weird, but she's actually quite easy to adapt to and can be incredible all around her. She's reliable by default and only shines more with upgrades, so she's a good pick for your first playthroughs. One of my all-time favorite shot types, period. Xion is a good main shot too. She does need a couple upgrades to really shine, though it doesn't matter too much when you have zany full screen coverage. If you want to play as a bullet hell, pick Xion. Fumikado is also a great choice for the early game as her damage output is among the highest at low power and she turns into a powerful spread shot later on. Her flash bomb is long lasting damage immunity with the caveat that you can't fire, which is actually absurdly powerful when combined with a skill that makes it reflect bullets. Subakura is the primary forward focus shot of this game with his reliable penetrating laser, above average damage, and fastly speedy. He can potentially be one of the most powerful sub-slot characters in the game with extreme bomb damage output and invincibility piercing. Ultimately though, this game favors spread or homing shots overall. Forward focus shots are certainly usable, but screen coverage tends to be one of the best things you can have in a shot. Skeleton Gal Sese is another notable main shot, and the same goes for Huaka, who's very similar. Both of them are effectively melee-themed shot types, being incredibly powerful in close range, but having a bit of trouble at longer ranges. They're also a bit tough to power up since they start off so weak. Huaka is theoretically a better shot because of her superior range, but I like Sese more. She's such a cute character, especially because of her massive boner laser. They both happen to be great choices for your sub-character as well. Sese is one of the most powerful default flash bombs and bombs on offer, and Huaka's upgraded flash bomb is absurdly powerful with whole screen coverage. You can easily charge it back up with the bullets it freezes, and with a certain stage 4 boss's skill, it can be used to instantly clear the screen, making it a bit of a game break. The support slot does matter too, it just matters less in the main and sub slots. However, you acquire character specific upgrades to make the character in the support slot do anything to begin with. Depending on who you pick, you can have doubled movement speed when not firing, instantaneous barrier recharging, brief invincibility upon acquiring a flash bomb, etc. There is a lot of personal preference here, though you'll never build out a team purely based on the support slot. I called this game a roguelite, so what are those mechanics like? As you beat bosses, especially flawlessly defeat your spell cards, and pop popcorn in the form of fairies, you gain alcohol. Alcohol is a currency of this game and can be used to purchase persistent upgrades from the characters you play as or meet. When you encounter a boss for the first time, then once a run is over, you can purchase their upgrades. Upgrades are not purchased mid-run and need to be bought between runs. There are no mid-run upgrades, which is why this game is a roguelite and not a roguelike. The vast majority of upgrades are passive abilities that apply to all characters. A lot of it is fairly milquetoast, such as bonuses of damage or health, though there are some more interesting ones here and there. There are also special upgrades called skills that usually provide a major, gimmicky benefit of some kind. Playable characters have a unique set of purchasable skills that only apply when they're in specific slots on their team, so you can only use Huaka's upgraded flash bomb season a sub slot, Tsugumi's doubled movement speed to season a support slot, and so forth. The game tells you what slots the characters can be in for the skill to apply, so it's never unclear when it applies. Hope you're literate. Upgrades tend to make a big difference, and you have access to a lot of good ones by default. I can't talk about all of them, so I'll simply note some good ones. One of the most essential upgrades is Huaka's upgrade, which increases the rate at which you gain power. I'll talk about that more later. For now, just know that power is rough in this game. You can take Iozane's upgrade to reduce your hitbox to a minimum of 20% of its original size. That's a Shrine Maiden special. I think your hitbox can be as tiny as a single pixel, though I can't confirm this as certainty. The Snake Gal Salami and Penguin Gal Medius? What kind of name is that? Both have upgrades relating to the speed and ease at which you charge flash bombs, which are incredibly important. With both of them combined, you can spam flash bombs until there are no bullets left to annihilate. Combine that to certain potent flash bombs, Tenkai's flash bomb and vulnerability upgrade, and the Haze Castle stage 4 boss's screen clear skill, and many attacks become completely neutered. Aside from acquiring ludicrously high base stats, flash bombs are the major game breaker here. As I mentioned before, not everything is a simple stat upgrade. Upgrades called skills give you brand new abilities and parlor tricks. Things like leaving behind a shadow clone decoy, getting a free screen wipe upon filling this flash bomb gauge, firing out umbrellas that clear bullets, MLG quick scope assistance, sometimes outright ignoring damage, etc. These things are often extremely powerful, and some are borderline miniature game breaks on their own. Of course, there are a handful of dubious upgrades in the pool. Not too many, thankfully. If you use your intuition, it's typically obvious which ones aren't that helpful for you. A 20% chance of resurrecting after game over isn't exactly all that useful. It's literally a great value Guppy's collar. Kuroji gets pretty shafted in this game too, with almost no useful upgrades and a below average shot. Poor scoundrel. Frankly, skills that only have a small chance or a specific negative condition to trigger aren't that worthwhile. Skills related to healing HP and not barriers are nearly useless as well. Regardless, thanks to upgrades, each team and its members can become incredibly distinct. Though I do think upgrade cohesion tends to be a little lacking, you can certainly carve out specific niches with each team. An example of this is how the new Emperor team can gain extremely prolonged periods of damage immunity, particularly with Fumikado in the sub-slot. Similarly, when placed in the main slot of the Scoundrel team, AOG has redonkulous survival with upgrades, not only starting with extra lives and bombs, but also taking half damage from all sources, so she's your face-tanking character. The Secret 5th team is borderline all about skipping attacks. Literally, it's got an upgraded bomb that instantly skips boss attacks and stage portions. I do think each team's upgrades should have been designed with a more consistent theme, but overall, every team is viable and upgrades only give them more unique tricks. The major problem with the roguelite mechanics is one that might be an upside or a downside, depending on how you look at it. Upgrades mean that BPoHC is easier than most other bullet hells. Combine extreme damage output, powerful flash bombs, and ability to tank dozens of hits before taking a death, and you have a rather easy game on your hands. Now, it does take a decent helping of hours to get to this point. However, it is one of the reasons why I would recommend this game for newcomers to the genre. It's approachable for your average Joe, especially because of its lean into roguelitiness. If you're like me and most of your bullet hell experiences on normal mode, then most late game fun comes from trying to capture as many spell cards as possible as fast as possible. I did turn up the difficulty of hard and unreal as I played, so this game was actually my first ever clear of a bullet hell on its hardest difficulty. In fact, in most of my Unreal clears, I didn't lose a single life. Seems like one heck of a jump for someone who usually plays on normal mode. Beyond Unreal, this game still has Absurdly Extra mode, which is literally thoughtless bullet vomit, but it's completely possible for the average Joe. That's right, you could be doing this. You do need many hours of gameplay worth of upgrades though. With some luck and a perfect build, this insane mess can be beaten while AFK. There's a video of that on YouTube if you're interested. I really like how Absurdly Extra went from being nearly humanly impossible to you could potentially beat it while taking a poop in another room. Ultimately, the core gameplay is a straightforward mix of bullet hells and roguelites. There's a lot to experience and play around with here, here, especially once you unlock the ability to mix and match characters regardless of team restrictions. This game has a power dynamic to it that I quite like, where you go from being weak to a demigod across the span of the game. It reminds me of Morrowind, which is one of my all-time favorite games, in part because I love that sort of dynamic. With upgrades you can go ham and make ham. You're only as overpowered as you want to be. If you're a masochist weirdo, you can still make this game hard. You can play on Unreal, forego upgrades entirely, or turn on instant death mode. Instant death mode is possible, though the game was obviously not remotely designed with it in mind, primarily because of how its stages work. In fact, that's a pretty good segue into the next section. BPoHC's main campaign is 6 stages in total, each with a boss at the end. There's also the extra stage, which primarily has a different set of bosses from the main campaign. Every stage consists of a certain number of cells as seen on the minimap. Each consecutive stage is longer than the last, with the exception of stage 6, which has the same number of cells as stage 1. In these stages, you'll encounter randomly chosen fairy formations or boss attacks with randomized modifiers called events, which I'll address shortly. For now, just know that events are the primary way the game mixes up the stage portions. There's a limited set of so-called small fry fairy formations that can be encountered in each cell. Since this game is a roguelite, the formations, their difficulty, and the events you face in them are random. There's also the mini-bosses who use various boss attacks based on bosses from previous stages. So if you're in stage 3, you can encounter a single attack from a stage 1 or 2 boss. They're not the primary star of the stages, however, and it's these fairy formations I need to talk about. Are they fairies? I have no idea, I'm just calling them that for convenience. There's a rather measly 30 fairy formations in total, which isn't great for a game where you'll likely encounter about 30 formations per playthrough. I definitely saw this formation ready come at you from behind at least 3 dozen times gathering all my footage for this. It's far from rare to encounter the same formation twice consecutively, usually only with different events or higher level fairies to mix it up. I don't mind a little bit of repetition, though this game would greatly benefit if the number of unique formations was at least doubled. These small fry formations are also not much better than the stage design in the rest of the games. In fact, it's overwhelmingly the same stage design as the rest of the series. A lot of these formations are recycled from the past games, usually with minor tweaks. It's as predictable as ever. If fairies spawn on the right, they're gonna spawn on the left, too. Jinx loves symmetry. On top of that, most of their attacks are still simple aim patterns or random bullet spam. At least that means you don't need to memorize many formations. Only 2 formations ever really surprised me. One is this attack where the fairies charge across the screen with lasers that break apart into bullets. The other is this one where they come from behind, copy and pasted straight from Evanescent Existence. These will probably catch you off guard, so it's a good idea to memorize them. Otherwise, you can just improvise your way through most formations and come out okay. For the most part, the formations are rather mindless, especially if you're a homing or spread shot. With a decent shot and some predictive skill, you may not even need to dodge a single bullet. In fact, for the most part, fairy formations tend to be fairly trivial. One reason I suggest Tenkai as your main shot is because of her horizontal coverage. That's usually not something too significant in vertical shmups, but the symmetry and speed kill ability of most formations makes her a smart choice. If you position yourself right, you can effortlessly plow through most formations, no need for dodging. I do get sneaking feelings I'm being cheap, though it's often a choice between cheaping a game out or dodging copious amounts of literal projectile figurative diarrhea. Sometimes it just feels cheap, you know? The random stage formations also means that there's nothing unique to a specific stage. Any formation can be encountered in any stage. Not even the extra stage has new formations. The game does compensate for this in other ways, though I do find it unfortunate that the only stage-specific encounters to be had are bosses. Oh, and speaking of the extra stage, BPoHC's Extra is effectively an extension of the main campaign. Stage 7, essentially. The extra stage is a bit more of the same as the main campaign, but you can face final bosses and mini-bosses here, and all bosses have bomb immunity. Both of those things can be brutally nasty sometimes. Anyways, much like standard Touhou Extra stage fare, the boss fight at the end is extra long. I'll discuss the bosses in general a bit, because I have a lot to say about them. The extra stage is plainly indicative of another problem with BPoHC's stage design, and it's that later stages have gone for a bit too long. Stage 5 is 17 cells long, and the extra is 20 cells long. That may not sound like much, but when most cells last 30 to 40 seconds a pop, it can take a while. That's a very broad average too. Non-cells can die in a literal second, and survival spells can take multiple minutes. Of course, getting a survival spell as a mini-boss is a rare oddity, but it's possible and painful. This can get a little exhausting, and since the game wants you to play the extra stage at least 7 times for completion, doing 6 of these runs night consecutively, like I did, is a bit draining. Exhausting can be a good word for this game sometimes, and I largely blame that on the prolonged late game stage portions. They can get so monotonous at times. Well, at least the fun extra bosses compensate for this. Now for one of the major gimmicks of this game, events. These can be a doozy. Events are randomly chosen boons that are rolled whenever you enter a cell. They may be beneficial, such as the alcohol gain up event, or they may be detrimental, such as the walking on ice event. Ice physics in a bullet hell. You never know what you're gonna get, and you can get up to 4 events in any given cell. Higher difficulties add nastier events and make bad events more frequent. Events do add a nice sprinkle of spice to the gameplay, though some of them are undoubtedly obnoxious. A lot of these are typically mild, manageable annoyances. The worst part is the combinations of these mild annoyances you can randomly get. This is where a lot of the unfairness of this game occurs. It's rather rare, but you can get something relentlessly sadistic, such as immortal enemies, barrier pierce, and bomb seal all at once. To summarize that, enemies can't die, they'll directly deal HP damage, possibly one-shotting you and eating a life, and you can't bomb in a desperate struggle to survive. If you get that combination, it could just as well be a game over, even if you're previously swimming in resources. The RNG in this game is rather cruel this way, and it means that a run can vertically nosedive at a drop of Subakura's big dumb eyeball hat. Heck, even one single event can make something nasty. Here I'm locked into focus as an already slow character in an attack that requires fast movement and misdirection. My slightly drunken gameplay here is proof of what you can get away with, though this is still a rather unfair combination overall. Plus, who really wants to deal with something like completely flipped controls or ice physics in a bullet hell? These are dumb, though at least not blatantly unfair. I can typically deal with them on their own, but on harder difficulties paired with difficult attacks and other events, they can be nightmarish to deal with. Imagine dodging homing lasers from behind while your controls are flipped and you're on ice. Now imagine the boss is immortal and those homing lasers are piercing your barrier. Based on a true story. Some events are a pet peeve of mine, guaranteed damage. However, thankfully not a big deal here. Poison is an example where you take completely unavoidable damage to your HP. Mercifully, it can't kill you and it acts extremely slowly. It's the equivalent of flies in your face, so I guess it's not too annoying. Worse is barrier breakdown, which instantly destroys up to 4 barriers. Sure, you can recover from this since barriers recover over time, but it's so dumb that this is a thing. I eventually realized that a bomb or well-timed flash bomb when the screen flashes can negate the barrier breakdown entirely. You're welcome for that advice since it's a genuine run saver. Infamously, the event system also means that extra lives are random. That's not a joke, you have little control over your stock of lives. No longer are extends handed out for score. You're only guaranteed 2 extends per playthrough of the main campaign, but that's it. When you get the extend event, you still need to perfect the formation to actually get the life, too. Hilariously, this also isn't really an issue, since this game is rather easy overall and the extend event is common on lower difficulties. I personally like a lot of the more double-edged sword events. Movement speed up, locked into unfocus, and time barrier, for instance, are rather fun to encounter. They aren't necessarily upsides or downsides, so they're fair and they make the encounter considerably more engaging. I almost always had some fun playing around with the bullets slowed by the time barrier. I really wish there were more events like these. Some of the more subtle events can be fun too. Gravity and anti-gravity push you down or up, respectively, and they can sometimes make attacks more challenging in a genuine, reasonable way. So some events are fair and can be fun to counteract, though it's probably only about half of them. Overall, the events are a quirky, mixed bag addition. They're a fun idea and they can add some spice to the monotonous parts of the game. I don't dislike a lot of them. However, when my controls are reversed and I'm sliding around on ice skates dodging complex attacks, you know I'm gonna hate the system in that moment. It's a good thing this game is so forgiving, otherwise I'd hate the system much more. It's another one of those things that needs some rebalancing and tweaks to truly shine. Additional positive events, more reasonable negative events, and more double-edged sword events would do the system some good and keep the moment-to-moment gameplay more engaging. Beyond its roguelite mechanics, one of the major gimmicks that sets BPoHC apart from traditional bullet hells is the movement gauge. At the bottom part of the screen, you have a bar that you can generally influence by moving to certain places on the screen. It correlates to where you'll move on the mini-map on the left side of the HUD, so if you stick firmly to the left side of the screen, you'll move left towards the Haze Castle route. You can only move straight forward or diagonally forward, so there's no going backwards or directly to the sides. The movement gauge also resets at the end of each cell, so you need to consistently stick to the left side of the screen if you want to go to Haze Castle path, and vice versa for the brilliant Pagoda path. You don't need to spend a whole run stuck to one side of the screen though, since the game gives you room for error and upgrades can speed up or slow down the movement gauge. In order to truly beat this game, you need to use these navigation mechanics. Of course, there are the 2 prominently advertised routes, the Brilliant Pagoda or the Haze Castle routes. Each of these routes has a unique set of bosses, backgrounds, and musical tracks. I personally like the Haze Castle a bit more since it's the better balance of the 2, aside from Kujiru. The Brilliant Pagoda route is fun too, though it's definitely a lot harder. Its bosses would be absurdly nasty if they were in a more traditional shmup. There's also the third route, the neutral route. Brilliant Pagoda or Haze Castle or neutral route just wasn't as catchy of a title. The neutral route is the one you'll have to take the most. It mostly consists of returning boss fights from the previous games and only has 2 different backdrops and tracks. There is new content here, but if you've played the previous games, you've already seen a decent chunk of it. I have an issue with the movement gauge. Its primary gameplay purpose is helping you choose a story route, but a lot of this game's content is in its neutral route. I did some math. Including the extra stage, you need to beat the game 20 times at a bare minimum. Of those 20 runs, only 6 of which strictly require you to deviate from the neutral route. There's no inherent gameplay incentive to go either route beyond story unlocks and fun, I suppose. You know how roguelikes such as Binding of Isaac have optional rooms like the treasure room or rewards for taking alternative paths? Well, BPoHC doesn't have anything like that. There's no real incentive to explore the map or plan out your movements until you get the borderline endgame upgrade that locates mini-bosses. Generally, you'll firmly hug one side of the screen or idle in the middle. I really wish this mechanic was elaborated on more because it feels rather half-heartedly implemented. It is an interesting quirk, but I wish there was more general incentive to engage with it. Like, here's a quick, simple idea. Maybe the player can see special cells that have a much higher chance of positive events. Maybe these special cells always generate a couple negative events too to make it a risk versus reward system. Anything to actually encourage the player to think ahead, explore, and take risks would make the system much more worthwhile. Otherwise, it feels like the game should just offer you a choice where you want to go next at the end of each stage instead of overcomplicating it. And obnoxiously, you can get an event that makes a movement gauge move randomly. I did say the movement gauge is rather forgiving, but you can never hug the side of a route because of this. Every route has a clearly defined cutoff on a minimap. If you're ever touching it, you're at the risk of your run arbitrarily being ended thanks to the random movement gauge event. It's not as rare as you might think, though I quickly learned to try avoiding it. It happened to me twice, so it can happen to you too. In order to truly beat the game, you must beat all 9 final bosses in the main campaign. Of these 9 final bosses, 4 of them require uses of navigation mechanics. You need to beat 8 of them to unlock the 9th final boss. You don't need to do all of it as the same team, thankfully. Some of the final bosses are playable characters anyways. Obviously, you can't encounter a boss if they're a character on your team. Once that final boss checklist is done, you have to go full neutral and encounter the new final boss you silently unlocked. Beat him and you'll unlock the extra stage. Beat each route in extra at least once and you unlock the extra plus A, which can be activated by going for the neutral extra route. I won't say any more as that's spoiler territory. I'll cover it much later on. But speaking of bosses are a key component of BPoHC since every stage ends with a boss, and there are a lot of bosses in this game. Bosses draw on that Toho influence with more vanilla dodging focused attacks as non-spells and gimmicky or tricky attacks as spells. Spells are special for having temporary damage invincibility, which wasn't in the game back when I originally played it. It's to prevent speed killing and cheesing, and I'm fine with it. Sese used to instantly decimate everything, but now she only decimates non-spells. Most attacks tend to go down fairly quickly anyways, so I think this temporary invincibility is a fair compromise. Like in the previous entries in this series, bosses are still extremely creative and enjoyable to fight. A lot of the new fights in this game feel extremely active, especially if you go the Pagoda route. Almost no part of any boss fight feels like filler, and very little blends together. Boss spell cards are heavy on gimmicks and tricks. Half the fun is finding out how to dodge them or even how to exploit them. I especially love most of the new final and extra bosses in this game. Plenty of returning bosses from the previous games too. They've seen some rebalancing of and occasionally been given some new spells. Certain characters do far better than others against certain bosses, which I think makes the game a lot more interesting. Some characters may actually have to take this one Fumikado spell head on, where she surrounds herself with a group of clones that absorb damage for her. Some characters just tear straight through it and completely nullify it before it could even become threatening. Non-spells are often annihilated by burst damage, but characters with extremely high burst damage tend to do worse against spells. It's an interesting trade-off that kept me playing around and experimenting. Tenkai may be a great all-arounder, but unlike Sese, she can't rip right through certain attacks before they even begin. So I still had fun replaying boss fights using different shots or builds, even into the late game. I'd be here all day if I talked about specific bosses, so I'll just mention 3 of my favorites. The Haze Castle route final boss, Taira no Choki, is a fun, mostly well-balanced fight. He's widely considered to be rather easy by final boss standards, though this is balanced out by him being a spooky ghost. Definitely a relatively pure bullet hell boss, being quite light on gimmicks. He throws nothing blatantly cheap at you, and I like the purple fire and bone skewer aesthetic he has going on. His theme is also among the best in the series and is incredibly fitting for the pacing of the fight. If hearing the boss's theme makes me directly recollect the fight, then it's a good theme. That's definitely the case here. Neutral Extra Boss Xeno A, isn't that the name of Elon Musk's recent kid? Is probably my favorite boss in the franchise. She's themed around probability in casino games. I appreciate how much effort clearly went into her fight, as it's filled to the brim with unique projectiles and thematically appropriate gimmicks. Despite having 2 survival spells, they're both exceptionally engaging. The first survival spell is ridiculously intense, and it has a thematically appropriate problem of requiring a lot of luck. I don't get her final spell though, it feels out of place. She serves as an in-universe explanation for the randomness of the game. RNG is canon and she's RNGesus. From now on, don't forget to pray to Xeno A before starting a run of any roguelike. And there's Yago, the Haze Castle route extra boss. Her character design is a bit of a mess, I really don't get what's going on there. Regardless, I find myself to be an easy sell of sword-themed boss fights in these games, and Yago's no exception to that. This time, she really does have a sword and not a bottle opener. Pretty active and mostly reasonable fight with some cute non-spells and straightforward gimmicks. Most people find her to be either the easiest extra boss or the hardest extra boss, which is pretty weird. Only problem I have with her is their overly brutal survival spell. Look at this, what am I supposed to do about this? The hitboxes on spears in this game are obnoxious and weird, and nowhere else is it more obvious. Even in those fights, the bizarre boss difficulty curve from the previous titles is still a problem. Their attacks can vary from being pushovers to being brutally hard to capture. Late game bosses, including final bosses, still tend to be surprisingly reasonable relative to a lot of earlier game bosses. Well, except Mitori, because she's just a brutally hard final boss. A Stage 5 boss may use an attack that takes no effort to clear, but then some Stage 1 bosses will use attacks that are completely unreasonable for how early in the game they are. It's less a problem with difficulty spikes and drops in general, and more so how extreme and sporadic they tend to be. An infamous case of this is the Haze Castle route Stage 2 boss, Kujiru, who is among the deadliest slug women I've ever faced in a video game. Her gimmick? Homing lasers. But not just any homing lasers. Homing lasers that don't curve at their trajectories, so they're always straight lines. Kujiru's final attack infamously involves homing lasers coming off-screen from behind. That has to be a war crime in most of the world, right? Geneva Convention had to say something about this. It's especially fun when you're playing on the hardest difficulty and get a survival version of it. It'd be really funny if that was something that happened to me. There's also Karu in the Pagoda route, whose poison gas is the only thing in this game that can instantly kill you, outside of instant death mode. It pierces barriers in HP, so no matter how powerful your build is, that poison can still snipe you. Doesn't help that it's ambiguous how poisoned you are, and that her attacks tend to be incredibly dense and frantic. I absolutely despise her. Don't care for her design either. She's got a sock on her head, which is deep symbolism for how much I hate her. The Pagoda route in general has a high concentration of difficult boss fights, so Karu is the only one I actively hate. Stage 3 boss Kunamitsu is a mostly good fight, despite the fact that his final spell card is comically stupid. Stage 5 boss Sanra's spell cards are chaotic and heavy on routing, which is one of my most hated things in bullet hells. Mitori is outright the hardest final boss in the series. Her attacks are incredibly fast, dense, and complex. Aside from a couple briefer attacks, you're gonna get hit by everything she throws at you on your first time. It's rather funny because it ultimately means the Pagoda route also has the most consistent and least wacky difficulty curve of any campaign in the series. It escalates in difficulty like any normal bullet hell would, and it doesn't suffer from Len'en syndrome too intensely. The Pagoda route may be consistently difficult, but the rest of this game has a lot of spontaneous difficulty spikes. There's a decent handful of attacks that are simply too fast, dense, or chaotic that are easily dodged consistently. Suzumi's first spell is a good example of an unfair attack. It's just plain superhuman, and even high-level players can't do it with any consistency. I needed exploits to capture on hard mode. Whenever these blatantly unfair attacks come up, I'm never sure if it's a deliberate design choice with the expectation that the player will be exceptionally powerful, or if it's simply bad design. This also means that flash bombs are nearly essential on harder difficulties, especially if you choose to forego most other upgrades. Some attacks, such as Xeno A's roulette survival spell, require flash bombs, which, thankfully, don't count against capturing spell cards. That's why upgrading your flash bombs is so important. In stark contrast to attacks that cheap you out, there's a lot of times where you can cheap out the attacks. As I mentioned before, you can potentially tear through most non-spells before they even begin. However, there's also plenty of blind spots and weird meme strategies you can use to conquer otherwise nasty boss attacks. There's a surprising number of attacks where you can cower in a corner of a screen and never get hit. A lot of icicle fall easy moments here. It's yet another reason I like Tenkai, because she can easily hit bosses behind her or to her side. I appreciate the safe spots, since they are amusing little doses of mercy. They also act as subtle world building, as everyone in the series is canonically an idiot. Now, to be fair to the game, they're usually not obvious at a glance. Some safe spots require good knowledge of your hitbox size and how the attack works. You won't get the safe spot attacks as often as you might think, though it's definitely more common than it should reasonably be. After fighting the aforementioned Kujiru and her homing lasers, you face off against Tadpole Person Kaizen. You can safe spot or cheese most of her attacks, with these cheese spots not exactly being hard to find, and even if you don't find them, she's oddly easy for a stage 3 boss. Her only real threatening attack is her first spell, and even that's fairly trivial once you figure it out. In most other bullet hells, she'd be a stage 1 boss. Here, she's a bit of mercy after an unusually cruel stage 2 boss. Variable difficulty like this isn't inherently bad design, on the contrary. It's good to give the players a break after tough fights or to throw a wake-up call in early on. The problem is how weird and extreme this game is with its difficulty balancing. Kaizen is so much easier than 2 bosses that come before her that's rather bizarre. Heck, the Haze Castle bosses after Kaizen are arguably easier than Kujiru anyways. Of course, the game sometimes pulls a fast one and makes the final bosses actually hard. Difficulty is more variable in BPoHC than any other game in this franchise, or any other game I've played really. At least the previous games put most of their difficulty into early mid-game and plateau in their latter half. Here, it feels like anything goes. And a lot of games like that in general. Bosses seemingly alternate between genuinely tough attacks and attacks that you can effortlessly clear if you huddle in a corner, but there's plenty of in between. These weirdly hard or easy attacks always stand out. Early game bosses are still most sporadic in terms of difficulty. Overall, the difficulty curve is a hypersphere, where certain stage 1 bosses have given me more grief than final bosses. Ultimately, Jinx does do a great job with boss fights. They're thematically well done, each boss is unique, and I overwhelmingly enjoy fighting them, but they really need to be better balanced. A stage 2 boss should never rival final bosses in terms of difficulty. A good difficulty curve should be rather linear and not like some kind of bizarre trigonometry function a chaotic math instructor would ask you to draw as a joke. There is a major fundamental mechanic I've neglected to mention until now. I figured it deserved its own section after I established the weird sporadic difficulty of this game. It's arguably one of the most infamous mechanics BPoHC has on offer, the power system. While you can eventually counter the problems with it using upgrades, it will make your life substantially harder in the early game. In fact, I wouldn't blame you if you threw a run because you simply couldn't build up power. The way the system is designed promotes a nasty feedback loop where one mistake can easily lead into many more, with rapid fire bad luck being incredibly difficult to come back from sometimes. On the far right side of the screen is the power meter, which is incremented by picking up these tiny red orbs. The more power you have, the more potent your shot is. Your shot's power level corresponds to increments at 20%, so you get more powerful at 20% power, 40% power, and so forth. Whenever you get hit, you lose 5% power. This isn't a particularly large amount of power, though it's definitely enough to be an annoyance. Getting hit at 100% power can mean a huge drop in potency for some shots. Unless you're high level with a good build, you'll always feel it. Even a secret character who you don't unlock until extremely late in the game has issues with how harshly losing power affects his shot. In fact, I think he's one of the more extreme examples of it. At least gaining power back tends to be pretty easy at that point. By default, power gain is very slow in this game. In the other entries in the series, you'll typically have full power before the end of stage 1. Here, your early runs may not get it until late stage 3 or even stage 4. With Huaka's upgrade, the early game power struggle gets far more tolerable, so her upgrade is a must. Because of the Klein bottle difficulty curve, some attacks in the early game are unreasonably brutal. 3 overly difficult bosses can be encountered on stage 2 alone, after all, so you may find yourself forced to choose between sacrificing a bomb or at least 5% of your power. I had a hard time getting into a game originally because of this. You just need to get upgrades to counter it. Of course, figuring out the boss attacks and what shot works for you are important too. Not helping the annoyance of the power drain is the fact that getting hit also temporarily disables both forms of bombing. Why? This was actually a giant problem for me that I was never able to fully adjust to. Damage often comes in pairs of 2 because my instincts tell me a bomb when I'm in danger, but then I get clipped at about the same time I try a bomb. So when the bomb doesn't go off, my wires get crossed and I probably charge into another bullet on accident while still repeatedly slamming the bomb key. It's simply a baffling design choice, and I've never heard anyone else bring up how annoying this can be. Just to be clear, this happens with all forms of invincibility, but it's the most obvious with on-hit invincibility. I actually started to play better when I decided to stop caring about using bombs when I was already in danger. It's often better to reserve bombs for skipping difficult attacks or formations. Flash bombs can still be used for any purpose though, they're overpowered anyways. And to add one more obnoxious layer on top of that, one potential event you can encounter is Giant Sudden Upset, which is a badly designed double-edged sword with a confusing name. It makes it so that shooting fairies actively drains your power. As a result, you're either forced into pacifism or reluctantly eating up potential huge power loss. Pacifism is possible, though it's often a massive risk that most formations weren't designed to account for, which is exactly why it's one of 3 events that wants a player to play like a pacifist. It doesn't help that if the formation is lush with popcorn fairies, you're going to eat up a huge huge power loss. Hope you get a formation with only a couple dozen or so fairies and not one of the ones that probably has, I don't know, 100. Even with all upgrades, you can just barely pace the power drain from killing fairies under this event. But if you get Giant sudden upset against a boss, it instead makes him drop an immense amount of power. I really don't understand the design intent here, though I strongly believe the game would be better off without this event. Similar to this is the event called Shot Power at Risk, which causes damage to remove 30% of your power. Here, you can at least reasonably avoid the power loss, so it's a far better designed event. However, since losing power greatly diminishes the effectiveness of your shot, it can easily lead to chain damage. I imagine this event is fun in tandem with something like Immortal Enemies or Bomb Seal. Watching other people's videos on this game, I've seen multiple players have their shot power completely eaten up by nasty attacks. Shot Power at Risk is yet another one of those events that can be fair, but gets ridiculously unfair when combined with other things. In short, shot power can be a big inconvenience, especially in the early game. It can still bite you later on, though it tends to be much easier to recover from at that point. It's another one of those things I would realistically hate more, but since it's not too big of a deal in the late game or with the right upgrades, I can't be too brutal on a game for it. I'm not sure if it should be removed entirely or not. I do like my shot progressing as I go along, and it's a fair punishment for getting hit. It's nowhere near as unfair as power loss in unconnected marketeers, at least. But I also really hate the idea that getting hit can greatly weaken your shot, potentially resulting in you getting hit more and more. I also hate that with events, the game can arbitrarily decide to effectively bite a chunk out of your power sometimes. If the system must stay, then I think the player should be given some extra room for error. The power related events should be removed, and max shot power could be 105% so that you get a free hit when your shot is at max power. That's just a quick idea that I came up with on the spot. Sound design in this franchise can run a gamut from being great to a cacophony of noise. The sound design is typically good, and all the individual sound effects are great on their own. Popcorn popping and defeating bosses are both satisfying to the ears. They feel just punchy enough and never get sickening. You're gonna pop a lot of popcorn here, so get used to that soft pap sound. I can't do a good impression of it. Similarly, the sounds of picking up a bomb, refilling a barrier, or fully charging a flash bomb are memorable and distinct. Audio cues such as those are always well done. There's good use of subtle sound design too. There's a soft rumble when you're dealing damage to something. Up against a boss, you hear a more intense rumble when they're low on health. Dangerous things tend to sound more intense, whereas positive things tend to sound more soft and upwards in pitch. I'm always surprised by how pleasant the chaos manages to sound at times. This is simply some good sound work. Oh, also, I like the da-da-da-da sound whenever you stumble upon 4 events at once. It's like the game celebrating you getting your controls flipped and bombs sealed again. There is a bit of a caveat though. You're always given audio cues for when bullets are fired. This is good. It's a cue danger's imminent and it contributes to the chaos. Sometimes though, it can be truly awful. Certain attacks are unbearably noisy. Just listen to this. That's the worst the sound design gets, thankfully. A much softer noise would have made this fight a lot more pleasant to the ears. The music is great, so I absolutely have to talk about that. In general, I think Jinx is a great composer. I view him as a mirror image of Zune of Toho fame in some ways. Whereas Zune's music tends to be more elegant and dramatic, Jinx's music tends to feel more chaotic and experimental. You can tell it takes some inspiration from Zune's work, especially in its uses of trumpets, but it still manages to have a tremendous amount of its own unique identity. Instead of trying to sound pretty, Jinx's boss themes typically reflect the theme of the fight and character. Stage themes lean towards being atmospheric and tend to be slower paced as a contrast to the boss themes. Some tracks may be pure pandemonium, but some may be relatively calm ambience with slow build-up. There's a pretty wide variety on display here. BPoHC has a massive soundtrack with a whopping 54 tracks in total. Some of this is admittedly a bit cheaty, as a lot of the tracks in this game are remixes, sometimes dual mixes, of boss tracks from the past games. Not a huge detriment, as they're all different enough from their original counterparts. They're typically less punchy here with rare exceptions. One returning boss, June, has a top-notch remix of original theme. It's a ridiculously good theme for a boss that will likely die before it even reaches the best part, which is such a shame. It's extra weird because she's a stage 1 boss. Never heard a stage 1 boss theme come out swinging like this before. In stark contrast, some final or penultimate bosses have relatively calm, jazzy themes. You never really know what you're gonna get. Every stage portion has a unique theme, with the only real exception being into neutral route. I think Jinx did a pretty good job with making these atmospheric while also being fitting for the chaos that can sometimes be erupting on screen. Upgrades do make it weird sometimes, as they're half the reason why you won't hear most boss themes to completion. Don't expect much in the way of like musical synchronization or anything like that. A bit of a shame, but what can you do with a more freeform, random game like this? I'm not going to tease you for much longer. Originally I wanted to go on for a long time about some of the later game boss tracks, but instead, how about I just play a semi-random selection of tracks for you? I chose half of these at random so that there aren't too many final or extra boss themes here. Have a pleasant little sampler. This could be fairly long, so if you aren't too interested in a music highlight reel, I'll include a timestamp to skip it on screen. If you're still here, have a bit of Garaya's theme. I'm surprised it never became a meme because of the funny Shamisen intro. At least I think it's Shamisen. So, in short, the soundtrack is top-notch. It's often moody and chaotic while also being catchy. It's almost always fitting for what's happening on screen somehow, and no tracks stand out as being bad. Jank's somewhat chaotic and unpredictable style of composing music is, in my mind, a huge benefit. Of all the games I've played on my channel, it's rather hilarious to think that this is one of the most pleasant feasts for the ears up to this point. I do have a small handful of nitpicks about the soundtrack. My biggest issue is a lack of variety in the Neutral Route stage themes. There's only 2. The theme for Neutral Route Stage 1 through 3 is a remix of the Stage 1 theme from EMS, which was also remixed for Stage 1 in RMI. Between these 3 games, I've honestly become really numb to this track. I do like the Neutral Stage 4 through 6 theme, but again, I've heard it so many times I've become a little numb to it. I also tend to have some mixed feelings for some of the remixes. Tenkai and Fumikado's new themes aren't necessarily bad, but they certainly don't hold a candle to the originals. These tracks tend to be slower and, as a result, lose out on the intensity they originally had. I like my music to be harsh, you know? And naturally, being an indie franchise with a top shelf soundtrack, there's a surprising amount of unofficial remixes out there. I personally tend to be a bit of a purist with my music, so I generally don't go out of my way to find remixes. However, there's plenty of rock, electronic, ambient, and more genres of remixes you can find on the internet for this soundtrack. If you don't like what's on offer here, then maybe you can find something more to your taste among fanworks. This series has a small but dedicated fan community after all, so by saying anything negative about this game, I've probably stepped on someone's toes. Or maybe I've gotten one minor lore detail wrong and someone's already left a comment about it. Oh well. As for visuals, I don't have nearly as much to say about it as the sound design and music. Jank's sprite work is fairly decent. It's nice that every character has their own unique sprites, bombs, and sometimes visual upgrades. There aren't that many hitches in the art in general, and the worst things may be some questionable anatomy in the portrait art or repetitive backdrops and stages. This series goes for slightly hazy, washed out colors. In comparison to Touhou, Len'en has a duller, darker color palette and less abstract environments. However, character designs tend to be pretty loud and exaggerated in comparison. Portrait art is good for the most part, and every playable character has multiple portraits. Jank's is a good, or at least inventive, character designer, and they tend to pull off androgynous looking characters well. Characters' appearance always relate to their species and abilities, which is something I always like to see. They've definitely evolved as an artist throughout the series, and I think it's fairly obvious here. Back in EE, you could tell they were trying to avoid drawing hands. Here, Tsugumi just has a weirdly long torso. A wise man once said that the most terrifying question you could ask about anime-style art is, what is happening to her anatomically? And speaking of Tsugumi, that's an incredible character design. She's literally like a kid riding a jet pumpkin. In her appearance in the previous game, she had an eggplant instead. This is the first and only series I'm aware of to feature slug people, so it is a pioneer in terms of weird anime girl designs. Some designs are outright bizarre. I mean, Kaizen here. Same goes for Hebrew and her crying eyeball wings. Yaego's design doesn't look too bad, though her pose is incredibly uncomfortable looking. Here's Mitsumo. No, not the kid, the mirror. That's just a sampler of some of the more bizarre designs on display. The rest are more normal, depending on your definition of normal. Ultimately, I always respect an artist who can create these bizarre anime girl designs that aren't overly sexualized. It's just a respectable feat. The character designs are unanimously unique, creative, and distinct. Great job in this regard. Every stage, with the exception of most of the neutral route, has a unique backdrop. That may sound petty, yet it's a nice little inclusion. They have a mid-90s primitive 3D modeling feel to them at times. I quite like that. It gives them some odd, slightly liminal charm. It's definitely not outright liminal, but it has a similar eerie and surreal quality at times, especially in the later stages. Variety in the backdrops is mostly good. I never really found any of them getting stale except the Senri Shrine Road. You'll see the Shrine Road throughout both the neutral route and the extra stage, which a bit more changed other than its color palette. There are some minor problems with the backdrops, one of which affecting gameplay and other just being something funny I want to show off. Here's the funny thing, it's the fact that one of Sukune's spell cards clips through reality if you get it in the right spot in the right area. That's it. As for the gameplay problem, I suggest that you get a Haze Castle Route Stage 2 or Brilliant Pagoda Route Stage 5 as soon as possible. They're both nightmarish levels to get the Melanism event on. Borderless black bullets on a black background are among the most infamous things this franchise has on offer. Speaking of bullets, there's a lot of bullets in this game. Aside from the black bullets, they tend to be visually distinct and their color coordinates to how much damage they'll deal. A lot of bullet types are standard fare, but late game bosses tend to have a lot of unique projectiles. Choki has his skewers, Mitori has her arrows, Xenoe has her Vegas souvenirs, and so forth. As per well-designed bullet hell fare, all hitboxes are somewhat smaller than they appear. I am glad that the bubbles are markedly less dumb in this franchise than in Touhou. They're actually relatively accurate to their hitbox size here. In fact, very few of the bullet types obscure your view of your character or other projectiles. No butterflies, thank goodness. I also like how absurdly powerful large lasers feel in this series. Between the screen shake, blinding light, and deep sound effect, they feel extremely intimidating. It's a shame they don't appear more often. I guess it's only vaguely related to visuals, but since it's a minor issue that couldn't get its own section, I'll clumsily slot this one in. I find the UI in this game to be a little clumsy. The circular main menu design is a bit off to me. I could never get used to it. I simply wish I could see all my options at once. Similarly, the upgrade screen is a bit of an overload. I guess I'm not sure of a better way to do it though. Oddly, the boss practice section on the menu is horizontally sorted one at a time, so if you want to get to say a stage 4 boss, you're gonna have to cycle through a lot of characters to get there. It's definitely annoying, but this game has bigger problems in the long run. Oh yeah, and Jank uses an engine of their own creation. Seems like a pretty functional engine. It's definitely held together by a bit more than duct tape and prayers to the Shinto god of game engines. It doesn't really fall apart unless I break the game or bomb something ludicrously dense. Better optimized than Danmaku-fu, that's for sure. Danmaku-fu may as well drop a frame for every 5 bullets on screen. This game can handle some carnage, though it eventually breaks thanks to Huaka's upgrade flash bomb. Literal game break. Alright, so for a good bit, I'm about to delve into spoiler territory. Skip to this timestamp on screen to avoid spoilers. I can't wipe your memory, so don't say I didn't warn you. You good? Big mistake. Before I get into the spoilers section proper, name some well-known pairings off the top of your head. Maybe you thought Salt and Watermelon, Bonnie and Clyde, Anchovies and Black Licorice, or I don't know, roguelikes are not telling you what you have to do. As I mentioned much earlier, in order to progress in this game's story, you need to beat each of the 8 default final bosses at least once each. Without the game ever mentioning you've unlocked something, unless I missed something, you then need to intuit that you have to go full neutral route once again. Here you'll encounter Suzumi, an informant who happens to be the true antagonist of this game. He has an unexplained murderous hatred of Subakura and hates everyone else because they're in his way. Suzumi is one of my favorite fights in the game. His gimmick is memory. You have to remember where the bullets are going or pay attention to them as they flicker around you. He's got a killer theme which changes names between versions in a funny, fourth wall breaking allusion to his memory manipulation. His survival is unrelenting mayhem, and the same goes for his first spell. On the other hand, his final spell is one of the easiest attacks in the game, which is a weird trend here. Final bosses tend to have really easy final attacks. At least Mitori has an excuse since her projectiles are also her blood, so she's becoming anemic. Anyways, you beat Suzumi and you get a quick ending where the protagonists get their memory of the encounter wiped, leading directly into the extra stage. I don't think Jinx wants you to show the endings proper, so I won't be showing them. I do want to mention that I find the ending artwork to be rather cute though. Now you have to beat the 3 extra bosses, Yago, Xenoe, and Haiji. I didn't mention Haiji, but she's one big Toho homage whose theme is effectively elevator music. Once you beat them all once, then the next time you fight Xenoe, you'll promptly encounter Surubami, the severely overpowered and oppressive priestess of the Senri Shrine. You know, the one who abducted most of the playable characters, the extra boss from the first game. She's returned from her vacation in the outside world, and, as per the rule of all bullet hells, wants to scuffle with the protagonist for no particularly good reason. Her reappearance would, theoretically, mark the end of the story, as Subakura was effectively just holding a temporary position as Shrine Maiden. Except, it's actually Suzumi in disguise! Count how many times I say Suzumi, by the way. We're already at 5 times. Even though the second version of Suzumi looks like he's gone full serial killer beast mode, this is actually him in a less nutty state. Suzumi Tuzu is a fairly fun boss. I adore the horror theme to this fight. Horror-flavored bullet hell like this is untapped potential. I especially like the survival where he's chasing you in the dark. That's actually pretty cool. I've seen other people try to recreate horror-themed fights like this, but they tend to lack the nuance, mystery, and intensity Suzumi Tuzu has, which are all inherently hurt by the upgrade system making it easy to curb stomp half of his attacks. Oh well. Beat Suzumi Tuzu and he wipes the team's memory of the fight again and escapes, leaving the game without any actual ending. If you beat Suzumi Tuzu's every team at least once, however, you unlock the secret team. This team consists of Suzumi, and Suzumi. Pretty hard choice as for who to put in the sub-slot. He's a victory lap of a team at this point. His main shot is a hybrid charge up and homing shot with near entire screen coverage that does a spectacular amount of damage. The knives still hurt without you firing them off, which is nice, since it takes a good while to fully charge it up anyways. I love his upgraded bomb too, which skips an entire cell instantly. Awesome stuff, it's just a shame that it's completely random when he acquires bombs. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's to balance the upgraded bomb, though this game never cared about balance before, so I doubt it. I think the general idea is that Suzumi's tampering with everyone's memories and or creating alternative timelines. That's why he retroactively appeared in original games, because he's time travel memory hopping. Add time travel to the CVS receipt of things Suzumi can do. I made a CVS receipt joke in my last video. I've already filed for joke bankruptcy. Each run is effectively either an alternative timeline, Suzumi messing with the protagonist's memories, or probably both. Pretty interesting that Xeno'Way is an explanation for the randomness, and Suzumi's an explanation for the roguelite elements. And the war, because he's the informant from much earlier in the game. Suzumi still encounters Suzumi as a neutral final boss. I'm seeing triple here. 9 Suzumis. Suzumi still gets his memories wiped, but then proceeds to kill Suzumi Tuzu and goes to sleep. Okay. You unlock the ability to freely make your own teams from this, by the way. The final stretch of the Suzumi scenario leaves you with more questions than answers. This game doesn't really have a conclusive ending, even if we assume Suzumi's route is a canon route, which is probably the case. Suzumi, despite being a villain, seemingly wins here. Well, he doesn't kill good old Subakura. I guess that part of his master plan is reserved for future games. Still, it's very different from the typical ending to these sorts of games, where the protagonists just have a cup of tea with the antagonists and work out their differences. Nope, Suzumi's still on the loose. In conclusion, I find the story rather interesting. It's rare to see games that outright tighter mechanics into a story like this, and I like the curveball that is Suzumi. It starts off as standard fare, effectively just being about the teams either resolving the incident or abstaining from it. Then Suzumi comes along and throws a wrench, or maybe knife, into the whole thing. Suzumi's an interesting character overall, which is why I don't like the fact that both his exact motivations and the extent of his abilities are left up in the air, the latter of which is hinted at with certain characters having some innate resistance to his memory BS-ery. Maybe you'll get resolutions in the next game. As it is here, BPoHC's story concludes with a bit of an ambiguous whimper. It's not a cliffhanger, but it's absolutely set up for future titles. I like the story and I still like the dialogue. I'm interested in more, which is exceptionally rare for me. I give the story and writing a thumbs up. Final thoughts? BPoHC is a good janky game. It's weirdly designed, rather clumsy at times, and has some missing potential here and there. It's such a distinctive oddball game that I can't help but love it. That's half the point of my channel after all. Obscure, strange, or unpopular titles. It's why I like to play the most anymore. Somehow I can forgive it for its stages being repetitive and its difficulty ranging from literally no dodging necessary to literally impossible resource drain. BPoHC is a very gestalt game. To use plain English, it's a game that feels like more than the sum of its parts. There's a decent handful of individually bad things about this game, but taken as a whole, the game manages to be surprisingly enjoyable. How odd. Great music, unique and inventive boss fights, and the game break factor all contribute to my net enjoyment of BPoHC. There's a lot on offer here. It's just that you need to suffer through that one fairy formation that comes off screen from behind dozens upon dozens of times. Probably 3 times per run. Now imagine that formation with flipped controls, ice physics, barrier pierce, and immortal enemies, all as a character like Suba who can't fire around themselves. I've rolled worse. It's ultimately a game where you're either unfair to your enemies or your enemies are unfair to you. I forgot to mention this in an appropriate section, but you can encounter survival spells as mini-bosses, particularly on the extra stage. One of these survival spells is 90 seconds long. Since mini-bosses generate events like any other stage formation, it's entirely possible you need to endure flip controls or some other goofy nonsense for up to 90 seconds straight. This honestly shouldn't even be possible, and it's one last instance of the quirky, sometimes unreasonable design of this game. It's why playing this game without upgrades can sometimes be an unpleasant experience, especially on hard or Unreal. And I can't help but wish we got more freeform bullet hells like this. I like the idea of creating a loadout and slowly upgrading my character as I play, eventually becoming exceptionally powerful by the end. It's a cute bullet hell power fantasy, and the endgame removal of team restrictions opens up a huge world of possibilities. I was a little bit sad when Touhou 18, Unconnected Marketeers, was substantially less open-ended in its design than BPoHC. Still, I mostly like Touhou 18, so it's a shame Zune probably won't reuse the roguelite gimmicks again. Who knows though. Anyways, yeah, I recommend BPoHC and its predecessors. Since they're free on Jinx's website, all it'll cost you is your time and I guess some hard drive space too. You should know that you're in for a quirky, janky experience. But for me, these games are quirky and janky in ways that end up making them charming, fun, and memorable. As someone who played BPoHC back when it was a demo, I've gotten more enjoyment out of it than most recent AAA releases released since. Best game I've reviewed on this channel up to this point? You know what? Sure. It's the best game I've reviewed so far. Why not? I've certainly sunk the most time into it. It permanently lives rent-free somewhere in my brain, which is more than I can say about the likes of Battlespire or Singularity. But, one more thing. I'm learning this like 3/4 of the way into making this video, but BPoHC is getting a revised version soon called Golden Chapter. Listen, I quickly checked the fan wiki to see if there's any upcoming releases, and they did not list it on there. It is a very me thing to accidentally not stumble upon important information like this, though. Supposedly, it'll switch the engine to Unity, update the balancing, and add some new playable characters. I'm not sure if it's a total remake or more of an expansion. By this point, I'm too deep into making this video and not double down on finishing it, so, I'd be willing to make a sequel video covering it when it does come out, but I need to take a break from this game to resume playing other games instead. Frankly, I might cry if it happens to come out between recording this audio and uploading the video. Anyways, that's it for this episode. I won't do bullet hells or roguelikes on this channel often, so expect first-person shooters or dungeon crawlers in the future. I can't always do these hour-long videos anyways. This is my longest video so far. I guess I cheated a little bit by technically covering 4 games in one though. Expect a shorter, more linear game next. If I go through with my current plan, which I often don't, then the next game will involve post-apocalyptic space cultists. So, see you then.